The first time I realized my life was being decided without me, it wasn't dramatic. There was no shouting, no confrontation, no moment that screamed, "This is where everything changes." It happened in a quiet room with glass walls, bad coffee, and a whiteboard full of decisions that carried my fingerprints, but not my name. I was sitting there, smiling politely, while a room full of people discussed a strategy I had written, word for word, slide by slide. They praised it. They argued over it. They approved it. And then someone said, casually, as if it were already settled, "She doesn't need to be here for the final call." That she was me. I remember looking down at my hands, still holding the pen I'd used to draft the entire framework. I remember thinking how strange it was that I had been invited into the room only long enough to build something, and then quietly removed before it mattered. No one noticed my silence. No one asked for my vote. No one even looked uncomfortable. Because from their perspective, nothing unusual was happening. This wasn't betrayal in the dramatic sense. It was worse. It was normal. That was the moment I understood something most people don't realize until it's too late. Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just assumes you'll cooperate. Sometimes it assumes you won't leave. Sometimes it assumes you'll keep fixing things quietly, because you always have. They thought I was patient. They thought I was loyal. They thought I was grateful just to be in the room. What they didn't understand was that I was watching, measuring, learning exactly how much they depended on something they refused to acknowledge. And when I finally stepped away, it wasn't out of anger. It was out of clarity. Because once you see who's making decisions about your life without your consent, you can never unsee it. And once you stop protecting a system that was never designed to protect you, everything changes. By the time people noticed me, they had already decided who I was. Not out loud, of course. No one ever announces those things. It happens quietly, through tone and timing, and who gets asked questions first. Through the way eyes slide past you in a room, like your furniture that came with the building. I had been standing next to Lucas for nearly 6 months before anyone asked what I did for a living. We were at a fundraiser in Georgetown, one of those places that tries very hard to look casual while serving wine that costs more than my first car. Crystal glasses, polite laughter, men in tailored suits pretending not to check their phones. The kind of room where everyone is important and no one is interesting. A woman in a navy dress leaned toward me, smiling with practiced warmth. "And you are?" "Nora," I said. She waited. I waited back. "Oh," she said finally, glancing at Lucas. "And how do you know Lucas?" There it was, the real question. "I'm his partner," I said. She smiled wider, relieved. The box snapped shut. Girlfriend, accompaniment, decorative. "That must be exciting," she said, "being part of all this." I nodded, because correcting her would have taken too long, and honestly, I was curious how far this version of me would travel. What she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the speech Lucas would give in 20 minutes, the one everyone kept complimenting him on, had been written at my kitchen table 2 nights earlier. He'd paced while I typed, asked questions, interrupted, then gone quiet in that way people do when they realize they're listening to someone smarter than them and don't want to admit it. "Say it like this," I'd told him, tapping the screen. "Shorter sentences, less certainty. Let them think they're filling in the gaps." He'd smiled. "You're scary when you get strategic." He meant it as a compliment. At the fundraiser, I stood behind him as donors shook his hand and praised his instincts. I watched him repeat my words with a confidence that only comes from not having written them yourself. It was impressive in a way, like watching someone drive a car they didn't know how to build. Lucas Grant was running for Congress. Young enough to feel fresh, old enough to feel safe. The kind of candidate people projected their hopes onto because he didn't challenge them too directly. He talked about unity, responsibility, the future. He talked about exactly what I told him to talk about. I didn't mind at first. I had chosen the background deliberately. After years in think tanks and advisory roles, I knew the value of anonymity. You can say things more freely when no one is trying to quote you. You can influence outcomes without being dragged into headlines or comment sections filled with people who don't understand policy but have very strong opinions anyway. Still, there's a difference between choosing to stay invisible and being erased without your consent. That night, after the speeches and applause and polite outrage at the state of the world, Lucas squeezed my hand as we walked to the car. "Good crowd," he said. "They're buying it." "They're responding," I corrected. "That's different." He laughed. "See? This is why I need you." Need. Not credit. Not acknowledgement. Need. At the time, I let it slide. I told myself it was temporary. Campaigns are chaotic. Roles blur. Things would stabilize once the race gained momentum. That was my first mistake. The second came a week later, when Lucas forwarded me an email chain I wasn't supposed to see. He'd meant to send me a calendar invite. Instead, I got a glimpse of something more honest. "Strategy session moved to Thursday," someone had written. "Lucas will bring the framework." Another reply followed. "Great. Keep Nora out of this one. We need alignment without distractions." Distractions. I read it twice, just to be sure I wasn't imagining the word. Lucas called me 5 minutes later, cheerful, oblivious. "Hey, did you get the invite?" "Yes," I said. He paused. "Everything okay?" "Of course," I said, and meant it in a way that scared me, because something had clicked into place. They didn't see me as a strategist. They saw me as an accessory. The helpful one, sure, convenient, reliable, but ultimately removable. And the thing about being underestimated is that it gives you time. Time to observe who speaks when you're not in the room. Time to notice which decisions are made casually and which are treated like sacred rituals. Time to see how power actually moves, not in speeches, but in side conversations and forwarded emails and who gets left off the calendar. I didn't confront Lucas. I didn't demand an explanation. I didn't even mention the email. Instead, I started paying attention. If they thought I was just the girlfriend, I decided, I might as well learn exactly how they plan to use that assumption. After all, if no one expects you to be dangerous, you're free to watch the whole machine from the inside. And machines always tell you how they're going to break, if you're quiet long enough to listen. Once you realize you're being excluded on purpose, everything sounds different. Meetings stop being conversations and start sounding like rehearsals you weren't invited to. Compliments feel less like appreciation and more like anesthesia, just enough praise to keep you calm while someone else decides where the knife goes. I didn't disappear overnight. That would have been suspicious. Instead, I stayed exactly where I was and watched the shape of my absence form around me. The first strategy meeting I wasn't invited to happened on a Thursday morning. I knew because Lucas mentioned it over coffee like it was an afterthought. "Long day today," he said, scrolling through his phone. "We've got a closed-door session with the senior advisors." I looked up. "Oh? On what?" "Messaging alignment," he said. "Just high-level stuff." High level? That was new. Usually high level meant Nora already handled it. "Do you want my notes from last week?" I asked casually. He hesitated, just a fraction of a second too long. "I think we're good." Good without me. I smiled and took a sip of coffee that had gone cold while I was still deciding whether to feel offended or amused. I settled on amused. It was early in the experiment, and I didn't want to contaminate the data with emotions. That afternoon, I did something radical. Nothing. I didn't send follow-up memos. I didn't anticipate objections. I didn't refine talking points or flag vulnerabilities. I didn't fix the draft press release that had a sentence so vague it could have applied to any candidate in any decade. I just let it be. You'd be surprised how quickly people notice when the invisible labor stops. By Friday, Lucas was pacing the apartment again. "Something feels off," he said. "The room wasn't landing the way it usually does." "Landing how?" I asked. He frowned. "You know, the energy." Ah yes, the energy. That mysterious substance men use to describe work they can't articulate. "I'm sure they'll adjust," I said. He looked at me like he was about to ask for help, then caught himself. "Yeah, probably." That was when I realized this wasn't just about exclusion. It was about control. As long as I was available but unacknowledged, I was useful. The moment I became visible, or worse, autonomous, I was inconvenient. The campaign office confirmed it a few days later. I stopped by unexpectedly to drop off a folder Lucas had left at home. The place buzzed with the kind of manufactured urgency that exists mostly to justify standing desks. As I walked past the conference room, I heard my words. Not my voice, my words. "The key is to frame the issue as inevitable," someone was saying. "Don't argue the facts, argue the timeline." That sentence had come out of my mouth 3 weeks earlier, over takeout noodles and a whiteboard that still smelled like dry erase marker. I leaned against the wall and listened. They debated the strategy. They critiqued it. They adjusted it. No one asked where it came from. Lucas caught sight of me through the glass and froze. The meeting paused. He stepped out, closing the door behind him. "Hey," he said, a little too brightly. "You should have texted." "I didn't want to interrupt," I said. A beat. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I was just thinking." "About?" "How interesting it is to hear your campaign talk about strategy." He relaxed, misreading the tone. "Right? We've got some sharp people." I smiled. "You always have." That night I opened my laptop and pulled up the shared drive I'd built for him months earlier. The one with annotated drafts, scenario maps, risk assessments. Hundreds of hours of thinking, neatly organized and quietly indispensable. I didn't delete anything. That would have been dramatic. Sloppy. Obvious. I just stopped updating it. No new versions, no refinements. No late-night insights sent at midnight because inspiration doesn't respect office hours. If they wanted alignment without distractions, I decided, they were about to get it. A week later, the campaign made its first real mistake. It was small, on paper. A phrasing issue in a local interview. The kind of thing I would have caught instantly. A word choice that alienated a voting bloc Lucas had spent months courting. The backlash was immediate. Nothing catastrophic. Yet. But I watched the response scramble like a fire drill led by people who had memorized the exits but never practiced using them. Lucas came home frustrated. The messaging team overcorrected. "Did they?" I asked. "They made it worse." I nodded thoughtfully. "That happens." He studied me, suspicion flickering. "You're being weirdly calm about this." "I'm not on the team," I said lightly. He laughed, relieved. "Fair." Except it wasn't fair. It was revealing. That was when I knew exactly how this would end. Not because I planned to burn anything down, but because systems built on uncredited labor don't know how to function once that labor goes quiet. And here's the strange part. I wasn't angry. I was curious. Curious how long it would take before someone noticed the architect was gone. Curious whether Lucas would connect the dots, or keep pretending the structure stood on its own. And curious about you, too. If you were in my position, watching your work shape decisions while your presence was slowly edited out, would you have stayed silent to keep the peace? Or would you have stepped back, knowing exactly what it might cost? Let me know what you would have done. I read every response. As for me, I poured myself a glass of wine that night and laughed out loud at a headline praising the campaign's instinctive clarity. Instinctive. Sure. If instinct now came with footnotes, mine would have filled a library. And the funny thing about libraries is that once you stop maintaining them, the silence becomes impossible to ignore. There's a particular kind of panic that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't look like yelling or chaos. It looks like people working harder while pretending everything is fine. Longer emails, more meetings, more voices in the room, less clarity. The campaign entered that phase quietly. At first, the changes were subtle. A new consultant here, a revised message there. Lucas started coming home later, his confidence intact but thinner, like a coat worn too many winters. "They're overthinking things," he said one night, tossing his jacket over a chair. "Too many opinions." I raised an eyebrow. "You're surprised by that?" He smirked. "Okay, fair." He didn't notice that he was asking me questions again, not directly, just little probes disguised as venting. "What do you think voters actually want to hear right now? Does this sound defensive to you? Am I crazy, or is this line not landing?" I answered carefully, briefly, nothing actionable. Think of it as conversational decaf, just enough flavor to feel familiar, not enough to keep anyone awake. This wasn't punishment, it was calibration. The next invitation I didn't receive was harder to ignore. The campaign announced a donor retreat. Private, strategic. 3 days in Boston, senior staff only. Lucas mentioned it while brushing his teeth. "Oh, I'll be out of town this weekend." "For what?" I asked. "Donor thing, strategy reset." I waited. "You're not coming?" he added, finally noticing. "No," I said. "Should I be?" He shrugged. "It's pretty internal." Internal. Another word that used to include me. That weekend I watched from a distance as photos trickled onto social media. Smiling faces, branded banners, panels with titles suspiciously similar to memos I'd written months ago. One caption read, "Back to basics, realigning the vision." I laughed out loud, alone in my apartment, because nothing says back to basics like reinventing a wheel someone already built and then charging donors to watch you do it. The humor didn't last. Monday morning brought the first real crack. Lucas called me from the car, voice tight. "Do you have a minute?" "I thought you were in a meeting," I said. I stepped out. That alone told me everything. "They want to pivot," he said. "Hard." "From what to what?" He exhaled. "That's the problem. No one agrees." I pictured the room. Too many egos, not enough architecture. Strategy by committee is like trying to land a plane with 6 people grabbing the controls. "Sounds messy," I said. "Yeah," he said. "I wish you'd been there." I let the silence stretch, just long enough. "They didn't think it was necessary," I said calmly. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice had shifted, defensive. "It wasn't my call." I believed him. That didn't make it better. Over the next 2 weeks, things accelerated. A policy announcement rolled out without proper vetting. Fact-checkers pounced. The messaging team contradicted itself across platforms. A local journalist asked a question Lucas should have anticipated and didn't. I watched interviews the way a structural engineer watches a bridge during an earthquake. You don't panic. You observe which beams strain first. The funniest part, if you have a dark sense of humor, was how often my name came up without anyone saying it. We should have stress-tested this. Didn't we already decide against that phrasing? I thought this was handled. Handled. By whom exactly? One night, Lucas snapped. We were eating takeout on the couch, news playing quietly in the background. An analyst criticized his campaign's inconsistent positioning. "That's unfair," he said. "We've been clear." "Have you?" I asked gently. He turned to me. "Okay, what's that supposed to mean?" I set my chopsticks down. "It means clarity doesn't come from confidence. It comes from coherence." He stared at me. "You sound like—" "Like who?" I asked. He stopped himself. The silence between us wasn't hostile, it was confused. Like he was realizing something important but hadn't figured out the shape of it yet. The next day, the campaign made a public hire. A senior strategist. Big resume, lots of buzzwords. Someone with a podcast and a book deal and very strong opinions about things he'd never actually implemented. Lucas told me excitedly, "This should stabilize things." "Maybe," I said. I didn't mention that the strategist's new framework was a diluted version of something I'd proposed early on and been told was too nuanced. Nuance doesn't sell well when everyone's in a hurry. The strategist lasted 10 days. 10 days of confusion. 10 days of conflicting directives. 10 days of meetings about meetings. When he left, citing philosophical differences, the campaign didn't announce it. They just quietly removed his bio from the website. A digital witness protection program for bad decisions. That was when Lucas finally asked the real question. We were in the kitchen. He was leaning against the counter, tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. "Did you see this coming?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "How?" I met his eyes. "Because I built the system you're trying to run without me." He flinched. Not angrily, honestly. "I didn't mean for this to happen," he said. "I know," I said. "That's the problem." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. For the first time since I'd known him, he looked unsure of which version of himself he was defending. The candidate, or the man who'd let other people decide whose voice mattered. Outside, the campaign continued its careful performance of stability. Inside, it was obvious to anyone paying attention that something essential was missing. Not a person, a perspective. And once you remove that, no amount of money or messaging can fake its way through the gaps. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel smug. Mostly, I felt curious again. Curious how long it would take before they stopped asking why things weren't working, and started asking who they'd pushed aside when it still did. The thing about power is that it doesn't like to admit when it's confused. Instead of asking better questions, it usually asks louder ones. The campaign didn't implode after the strategist left. That would have been too clean, too honest. What happened instead was far more familiar. They reorganized. New titles appeared. Old roles were renamed. People who had made the mistakes were suddenly promoted to oversee them. It was like watching a ship hit rough water and respond by rearranging the deck chairs. Lucas tried to explain it to me one night, pacing again. He was back to pacing, which told me everything I needed to know. "We're streamlining decision-making," he said. "Reducing bottlenecks." "By adding more people?" I asked. He winced. "It sounds worse when you say it like that." "It is worse when it's like that," I said. He laughed weakly, then stopped. "You're not being very supportive." There it was. The unspoken expectation, finally said out loud. "I'm being accurate," I replied. "You just got used to confusing that with support." He sat down, rubbing his face. "I don't know what you want from me." That was the moment I realized how deep the misunderstanding went. "I don't want anything," I said. "That's what scares you." He looked up sharply. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you're used to me wanting things quietly. Access, influence, a seat I never asked to be named to. Now that I don't, you don't know where I fit." He didn't argue. He couldn't, because the truth was uncomfortable. My withdrawal hadn't just destabilized the campaign, it had destabilized him. Lucas had built his confidence on being surrounded by people who made him feel capable. Advisors, consultants, me. Once one of those mirrors stopped reflecting back reassurance, the image cracked. The campaign office felt it too. I heard about it through Caleb, who called me one afternoon with the kind of laugh that comes from exhaustion rather than humor. "It's chaos," he said. "They're debating messaging like it's a philosophical exercise." "Isn't it?" I asked. "Not when you're 6 weeks out from a primary," he replied. "They're circling the same ideas you proposed months ago, but now everyone's arguing over ownership." Ownership. That word again. "What about Lucas?" I asked. "He's trying to keep the peace, which means nothing's getting decided," I leaned back in my chair. That's what happens when consensus replaces leadership. Caleb paused. You're not wrong. But you know what the wild part is? What? No one's saying your name, but everyone's referencing how things used to be. I smiled. Nostalgia is a funny thing. That night, the campaign made a public misstep that couldn't be smoothed over. A policy proposal went live on the website, one that contradicted a previous stance Lucas had taken in a televised debate. Not subtly, directly. Screenshots spread. Commentators noticed. The response was slow, fragmented, defensive. I watched the press conference from my laptop, sitting at my kitchen table with a bowl of cereal, because adulthood is mostly about having cereal for dinner while watching other people self-destruct professionally. Lucas spoke carefully. Too carefully. Each answer sounded like it had been approved by 3 committees and believed by none. A reporter asked, "Can you clarify your position?" Lucas smiled. "What I've always said is—" He stopped. Just for a second. But it was enough. The hesitation made headlines. Later that night, my phone buzzed. A message from Lucas. "Can we talk?" I stared at it longer than necessary. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I knew exactly what he was going to ask. We met at a quiet bar. Neutral territory. Public enough to keep emotions in check, private enough to avoid witnesses. He looked tired. Not the charming campaign-tired look. The kind that comes from realizing you might not be as prepared as you thought. "They're asking me to bring you back in," he said without preamble. "As what?" I asked. "A consultant. Off the books." I let out a short laugh before I could stop myself. "Of course they are." "What?" he said, defensive. "It's a compromise." "For whom?" I asked. He hesitated. "For everyone." I leaned forward. "Lucas, a compromise where I do the work without the authority isn't a compromise. It's a return to the original problem." He frowned. "You're being rigid." "No," I said. "I'm being precise." He ran a hand through his hair. "They're worried about optics." "There it is," I said softly. "Not effectiveness, not outcomes. Optics." He looked away. I could have said yes. I could have stepped back into the shadow, fixed the contradictions, smoothed the narrative, carried the weight quietly like before. It would have been easier. For everyone else. But clarity has a cost. "If I come back," I said slowly, "it's publicly, with a defined role, decision-making authority, and acknowledgement of past contributions." His head snapped up. That would cause backlash. "From whom?" "The donors, my mother, the team." I nodded. "So everyone who benefited from pretending I wasn't there." He didn't deny it. "I can't promise that," he said finally. "I know," I said. "That's why I'm not coming back." The silence between us stretched. This one was heavier. Final. "You're walking away," he said. "I already did," I replied. "You're just noticing now." He stared at the table. "You know this could cost me the election." I met his eyes. "You know I kept it from costing you sooner." That landed. Hard. Outside, the city hummed along, unconcerned with campaign dynamics or uncredited labor. I finished my drink and stood. As I walked home, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because things were falling apart, but because they were finally doing so honestly. You can't build a future on borrowed clarity and expect it to hold once the lender steps away. And whether Lucas understood that yet or not, the campaign was about to learn a lesson systems always resist until they have no choice. You don't notice the foundation while it's there. You only notice when it's gone. The campaign didn't collapse after I said no. That would have been too convenient, too cinematic. What happened instead was slower and far more revealing. They tried to function without me. At first, they told themselves it was working. Press releases went out on time. Fundraising emails still hit inboxes at precisely optimized hours. Someone even created a new internal Slack channel called Strategy Alignment, which mostly consisted of people reposting articles they hadn't read and reacting with the thumbs up emoji like it was a substitute for thought. From the outside, it looked fine.
From the inside, it was duct tape and optimism. Caleb kept me updated, partly because he couldn't help himself, and partly because he seemed fascinated by what happens when a system loses its spine but insists on standing upright. "They're arguing over wording again," he told me one afternoon. "Not substance, just wording." "Of course they are," I said. "Words feel safer when you don't want to admit you don't know what you're saying." He laughed. "Someone actually said, 'Let's just make it inspirational.'" I groaned. "That's not a strategy. That's a scented candle." The real damage showed up in places no one was watching closely enough. Local organizers started improvising because they weren't getting clear guidance. Policy briefs contradicted each other depending on which advisor had touched them last. Donors began asking questions that didn't have clean answers anymore. And Lucas, poor, ambitious, increasingly cornered Lucas, started making decisions alone. That might sound like leadership. It wasn't. It was survival. We met again by accident this time, at a cafe near the campaign office. I was there for the coffee. He was there because his office had become a war room, and even he needed air. He looked up, surprised, then wary. "Nora? Lucas?" We stood there awkwardly for a moment, like two people who used to share a language and weren't sure which words were still allowed. "You look busy," I said. He smiled thinly. "That's one way to put it." We ordered separately, sat separately, then, inevitably, talked anyway. "They're blaming each other," he said quietly, staring into his cup. "Everyone has a theory about what went wrong." "Do any of them include you?" I asked. He flinched. "Not yet." I nodded. "Give it time." He exhaled. "You know, for a while, they blamed you." I raised an eyebrow. "For leaving?" "For not warning us." I laughed, not cruelly but genuinely. "Lucas, I warned you by existing." That earned a tired smile. "I know." He hesitated, then said something that surprised me. "They didn't realize how much you were holding together." I studied him. "And now?" "And now," he said, "they're starting to." That was the shift. Not the mistakes, not the bad press, not even the polling dip. The shift came when people stopped asking what was wrong and started asking who used to handle this. You can ignore a missing voice for only so long before the silence starts answering back. The campaign attempted one last fix. They brought in a committee. I wish I were joking. A temporary decision council composed of senior advisors, donors' representatives, and one person whose job description seemed to be has strong opinions. Caleb described the first meeting to me in detail. They spent 40 minutes debating whether decisiveness feels aggressive. I closed my eyes. Please tell me you're lying. I wish. Committees don't create clarity. They distribute responsibility until no one can be blamed. And when responsibility dissolves, accountability follows. The next public stumble was worse than the last. A major endorsement was announced prematurely. The endorser hadn't finalized their support. Someone jumped the gun, assuming alignment that didn't exist. The retraction was messy. Apologies followed. Screenshots lived forever. That was when the donor stopped smiling politely and started asking pointed questions. Questions like, who's in charge of messaging? Who signs off on strategy? Why does this campaign feel reactive? And finally, the one that landed hardest. Where is the person who used to prevent this? Lucas didn't answer that question directly. He couldn't, because admitting the truth would mean acknowledging that the campaign's organic coherence had come from a woman they'd quietly sidelined for being inconvenient to the story they wanted to tell.
I heard about the closed-door meeting from Caleb the next day. They're debating whether to reach out again, he said. To me? I asked. Yes, officially this time. And? And half of them think it would look weak. I smiled. Of course they do. Here's the funny thing about looking weak. It's usually just honesty arriving late. Lucas called me that evening. His voice sounded steadier than it had in weeks. Resigned, maybe, or resolved. They want to make you an offer, he said. I'm listening, I replied. Public role, senior strategist, authority over messaging and policy alignment, clear scope. And credit? I asked. A pause, then, yes. I leaned back, considering. This was the moment they thought they were fixing things. What they didn't understand was that the decision had already been made, just not by them. I'm not coming back, I said. He didn't argue. He just nodded slowly as if he'd expected it. Why? He asked. Because now you see my value, I said. But only because you felt my absence, and I don't build futures on conditions like that. He absorbed that quietly. You know, he said after a moment, if I lose, they'll say it's because I didn't listen. And if you win? I asked. They'll say I never needed you. I smiled. That's the paradox. We ended the call politely, almost kindly. That night I watched a panel discussion dissecting the campaign's loss of narrative discipline. Experts speculated. No one named me. They didn't have to. The absence had become the story. And here's what I want to ask you, because this is where it stops being just my experience. If you were in my position, watching people finally recognize your value only after they dismissed your presence, would you have stepped back in to save the outcome? Or would you have let the consequences stand, even knowing they might rewrite the story without you? Tell me what you would have done. I read every comment. As for me, I poured another glass of wine and turned off the television. Not because I didn't care anymore, but because for the first time, I wasn't responsible for holding something together that refused to acknowledge who built it in the first place. And that kind of freedom? It's quieter than revenge, but it lasts a lot longer. When people realize they can't pull you back, they don't immediately let you go. First, they try reinterpretation. The campaign entered what I privately called its revisionist phase. Statements were reframed. Decisions were relabeled. Things that had clearly failed were now described as necessary recalibrations. People spoke in the passive voice, as if clarity had simply wandered off on its own one day, bored and unappreciated. Lucas stopped calling. That was new. For months, even when things were tense, there had been some form of contact. Updates, questions, apologies disguised as logistics. Now there was nothing, which told me he was being advised to create distance. You don't sideline someone quietly and then keep checking in. You pretend they were never central to begin with. Caleb confirmed it a few days later. They're rewriting the origin story, he said over the phone. Apparently the campaign was always collaborative, no single architect, just vibes. Of course, I said. Democracy, but make it aesthetic. He laughed, then sighed. They're trying to stabilize the narrative before the next debate. And how's that going? They're polling slogans, he said, not positions. Slogans. I closed my eyes. That's like treating a broken leg with a motivational poster. Despite everything, part of me felt oddly calm. Not smug, not vindicated, just finished. I hadn't realized how much energy it took to constantly contextualize myself for other people, to soften ideas, to translate complexity into something more palatable, to anticipate reactions before they happened. Without that weight, my days felt quieter, sharper. I went back to my own work, consulting, writing, advising organizations that understood the difference between listening and waiting to talk. And yet, the campaign kept orbiting me like a satellite that had lost its center. The debate happens on a Tuesday night. I hadn't planned to watch it. I told myself I didn't care, that I was done. Then, 10 minutes before it started, I found myself sitting on the couch anyway. Laptop open, volume low. Old habits. Lucas looked composed on stage, well prepared, confident enough. The opening questions were predictable. He handled them fine. Then came the pivot. The moderator asked about a policy area we had once mapped in painful detail. Trade-offs, timelines, unintended consequences. The kind of question that looks simple until you answer it wrong. Lucas hesitated. Not visibly, not dramatically, just long enough. He gave a response that wasn't incorrect, but it wasn't anchored. It floated. It sounded like something that had been approved by consensus rather than believed. The opponent seized the opening immediately. The contrast was brutal. By the time the segment ended, the difference was obvious even to casual viewers. One candidate was navigating a structure they understood. The other was reciting from memory. I muted the TV and stared at the blank screen for a moment. That was the first time I felt something like grief. Not for the campaign, not even for Lucas. For the version of the future that could have existed if competence hadn't been treated like a threat to optics. The fallout was swift. Analysts noted the lack of specificity. Donors called emergency meetings. Internal emails leaked. Nothing scandalous, just evidence of disorganization. That might have been worse. The next morning, my phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. I let it go to voicemail. "Nora," Lucas's voice said. Tired, measured. "I know you said you were done. I respect that. I need to talk. Not about the campaign. About us." I listened to the message twice. Then I didn't respond. That might sound cold. It wasn't. It was necessary. Because this wasn't about us anymore. It was about what happens when personal relationships are used as pressure points to fix structural problems. Later that day, Caleb texted me a screenshot. A draft op-ed. Internal. Unpublished. The working title made me laugh out loud. Reclaiming Focus. Why Our Campaign is Stronger Than Ever. I skimmed it quickly. It was a masterclass in denial. They framed the chaos as evolution, the confusion as growth pains, the absence of a clear strategic voice as proof of inclusivity. There was one line that stood out. We've moved beyond reliance on any single perspective. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I laughed again, this time softer. Because the thing about moving beyond reliance is that it sounds brave, until reality checks whether you've replaced what you discarded, or just convinced yourself you didn't need it. That evening, something unexpected happened. A journalist reached out. Not a gossip columnist, not a political hitman, a serious policy reporter I'd spoken to years ago, back when my name still appeared in footnotes. Off the record, her email read, "I'm researching the campaign's strategic shift. Your name keeps coming up." I didn't reply immediately. I wasn't afraid. I just wanted to be deliberate. When I finally wrote back, I kept it simple. "I'm no longer involved," I said, "but I'm happy to discuss structural dynamics in modern campaigns. On background only." She agreed. We spoke for an hour. I didn't vent. I didn't accuse. I didn't tell her anything she couldn't verify independently. I spoke about patterns. About invisible labor, about how organizations often mistake silence for compliance, and compliance for loyalty. I never once mentioned Lucas by name. I didn't have to. The article ran a week later. It wasn't explosive. It didn't call anyone out. But it introduced a concept that made people uncomfortable. That campaigns often fail not because of ideology, but because they sideline the people doing the hardest thinking. The timing was unfortunate for them. Within days, donors started asking different questions. Not about slogans, not about optics, about process, about accountability, about who actually made decisions. Lucas called again. I didn't answer. Not because I was angry, but because the system was finally doing what it had resisted all along, learning without me carrying it. And the strangest part? For the first time, I didn't feel the urge to intervene. I felt something better. Trust. Not in the outcome, but in my choice to stop holding together something that refused to hold me. Whatever happened next would happen honestly, and that, I'd learned, mattered more than winning. The moment a system realizes it's being observed, it starts performing. That was the phase the campaign entered next. After the article ran, everything became louder but thinner. Statements were sharper, smiles were wider. Transparency was suddenly everyone's favorite word, used so often it lost all meaning, like when people say authentic while reading from a teleprompter. Lucas went back on the offensive, not publicly, privately. He didn't call me, he didn't text. Instead, mutual acquaintances began reaching out with strangely similar messages. I heard you've been talking to reporters. People are worried you're being misunderstood. You know how these things can spiral. It was almost impressive how coordinated the concern sounded. I replied politely, briefly, truthfully. I haven't said anything untrue. That usually ended the conversation. The campaign released a restructured leadership chart the following week. New titles, new committees, new faces positioned as decision-makers. One thing remained consistent. My name was nowhere on it. Caleb sent me the chart with a single line underneath. They removed the ghost, still haunted. I laughed, harder than I probably should have. Because here's the thing they still didn't understand. Erasing someone on paper doesn't erase the absence they leave behind. It just highlights it. The cracks were widening now. A major donor publicly paused contributions. Another quietly redirected funds to a different race. Volunteers stopped sharing content with the same enthusiasm. You can fake messaging, but you can't fake belief. The campaign tried a rebrand. New slogan, new color palette, new energy. Someone described it to me as a reset. It's not a reset, I said. It's a coat of paint on a house with structural damage. That weekend, I attended a conference in Boston. Policy-focused, low drama, my favorite kind. I wasn't on the main stage, I never am, but I participated in a closed session with a handful of strategists, academics, and organizers, people who actually do the work and don't need to posture about it. Halfway through the discussion, someone asked a question that felt familiar. How do you maintain coherence in a campaign when too many voices are involved? I answered instinctively, calmly, directly. You decide early who has synthesis authority, I said. Not veto power, not ego power, synthesis. Someone who integrates input and commits to decisions. A few people nodded. Someone else added, and what happens when that person isn't respected? I paused. Then you don't have a strategy problem. You have a power problem. The room went quiet. After the session, a woman I didn't recognize approached me. I think I know who you are, she said, smiling. I returned the smile. That's dangerous. She laughed. I work with one of your former donors. Ah. They've been asking why the campaign feels different, she continued. Less grounded. Change does that, I said neutrally. She tilted her head. Or absence. I didn't correct her. The thing about being underestimated is that people assume you're eager to be seen, that you're waiting for recognition, validation, a public reckoning. I wasn't. I didn't want to be restored to the story. I wanted the story to function without borrowing my credibility. Meanwhile, the campaign made a mistake it couldn't spin. An internal memo leaked, not because of malice, because of carelessness. It outlined a proposed shift in policy language that directly contradicted a core campaign promise. Worse, it framed the contradiction as a necessary ambiguity. Necessary ambiguity. The phrase spread like wildfire. Commentators seized on it. Late-night hosts had a field day. Voters noticed. Lucas held another press conference. He denied the memo reflected official strategy, blamed draft language, promised clarity. The problem was that clarity requires a source, and the source had walked away. That night, Lucas showed up at my door. Not metaphorically, literally. I opened it slowly, more surprised than alarmed. He looked worse than the last time I'd seen him. Thinner, tighter, like someone who hadn't slept without rehearsing conversations in his head. "I won't stay long," he said quickly. "I just need to understand something." I stepped aside, let him in. He didn't sit, he paced. Of course he did. "Did you plan this?" he asked. "Plan what?" I replied. "All of it. The timing, the article, the leaks, the fallout." I shook my head. "No." He stopped pacing. "Then why does it feel like everything started falling apart when you left?" "Because it did." I didn't say that. Instead, I said, "Because you built something that depended on a voice you didn't protect." He stared at me. "I tried to bring you back." "On your terms," I said. "Not as an equal, as a fix." He ran a hand over his face. "I didn't realize." "That's the sentence everyone says right before consequences," I replied. Silence settled between us. Not tense, just heavy. "What do you want now?" he asked. I met his eyes. "Nothing." He looked almost relieved. Almost. "You're really done," he said. "Yes." He nodded slowly, as if accepting a verdict. As he turned to leave, he paused. "They're saying you're the reason this is happening." I smiled, just a little. "Of course they are." "And you're okay with that?" I considered it, then answered honestly. "I've been blamed for better things." After he left, I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, breathing in the quiet. The campaign would continue, with or without him, with or without me. But something fundamental had shifted. They could no longer pretend the absence was imaginary, and whether they admitted it publicly or not, they now understood something they should have learned earlier. You can remove a person from the room. You cannot remove the impact of ignoring them. Not without paying for it. There's a strange calm that settles in right before a public collapse. Not panic, not urgency. Calm. It's the moment when everyone involved realizes the outcome is no longer fully controllable, but pretends otherwise out of habit. The campaign entered that calm 2 weeks before the primary. From the outside, it looked composed. Ads still ran, volunteers still knocked on doors. Lucas still shook hands, smiled, said the right words in the right order. But underneath, the certainty was gone. Caleb described it best during one of our last phone calls. "It feels like everyone's waiting for permission to admit this isn't working," he said. "Who would give that permission?" I asked. "That's the problem," he replied. "No one knows anymore." I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. The signs were already public. Polling flattened, then dipped. Not dramatically, just enough to cause anxiety without triggering decisive action. The worst possible zone. Too bad to ignore. Too close to fix easily. The campaign responded with intensity instead of clarity. More events, more speeches, more talking, less listening. Lucas gave an interview that should have been a reset. Instead, it became a case study in overcorrection. He tried to address every criticism at once, explained too much, qualified answers that didn't need qualifying, promised specificity without actually delivering it. Watching it felt like watching someone try to plug a leak by pressing harder on the pipe. The media reaction was polite but sharp, unfocused, reactive, uncharacteristically uncertain. Uncharacteristic. That word stuck with me. Because the version of Lucas they were describing, the one who hesitated, who over-explained, who lacked a clear center, that wasn't uncharacteristic at all. It was what happened when the structure around him disappeared. The campaign made one last attempt to reassert control. They announced a major policy address. Big venue, Big buildup. The kind of speech meant to remind everyone why the candidate mattered. Caleb texted me from backstage the morning of the event. "They're nervous," he wrote. Like, whispering nervous. "Are they prepared?" I asked. "Prepared," he replied. "Or aligned." I smiled grimly. The speech itself was fine. Technically sound, professionally delivered, applause at the right moments. But something was missing. There was no through line, no spine, no sense that the words were connected to a deeper understanding of trade-offs and consequences. It sounded like a campaign trying to remember who it used to be. The commentators noticed. "So, what is the core message now?" one analyst asked afterward. Another said, "It's not that the ideas are bad, they just don't feel owned." Owned. That was the word. Later that night, my inbox filled with messages from people I hadn't heard from in months. Former colleagues, policy friends, quiet observers. Not congratulating me, not apologizing, just saying things like, "I get it now. That must have been exhausting. I didn't realize how much you carried." I replied politely, briefly. Validation feels different when it arrives late. Not useless, but less necessary. Lucas didn't contact me again. I heard through Caleb that he'd finally pushed back against his inner circle, demanded clearer authority, fewer voices. It might have helped, if it hadn't come so late. The primary happened on a rainy Tuesday. I didn't watch the results live. I went for a walk instead. No headphones, no phone in hand. When I got home, there were 3 missed calls and a dozen texts. The result was close, painfully close. Lucas lost by a narrow margin that would fuel analysis for months. If this had happened a year earlier, I would have dissected every variable: turnout, messaging, timing, external factors. That night, I didn't. Because I already knew the answer everyone would avoid. You don't lose elections only on policy. You lose them when the people doing the hardest thinking stop believing they belong. The concession speech was dignified. Lucas thanked his team, his supporters, his family. He didn't mention me. I didn't expect him to. What mattered was what happened after. Donors quietly reassessed their involvement. Staffers updated resumes. Advisors repositioned themselves as if they'd always been cautious. And the narrative began to shift. Not publicly, yet, but in the places where truth eventually settles. People started asking questions. Not why the campaign failed, but how it had been structured to succeed in the first place. And slowly, almost reluctantly, the answer emerged. Not as an accusation, as a realization. That a campaign built on invisible labor can look strong, right up until the moment the labor becomes visible by leaving. I didn't celebrate the loss, but I didn't mourn it either, because this wasn't about winning or losing. It was about something far more uncomfortable for everyone involved. Acknowledging that the story they told themselves, the one where leadership was effortless and collaboration was organic, had been incomplete. And once a story cracks like that, it doesn't matter how loudly you repeat it. People start listening for what's missing instead. And silence, when it's earned, is very loud. The aftermath didn't arrive all at once. It came in waves, quiet, uneven, and deeply unflattering to the myth everyone had been telling themselves. In the week after the loss, the campaign office emptied out faster than a free snack table at a budget airline conference. People hugged in doorways, promised to stay in touch, updated LinkedIn titles with impressive speed. Lucas disappeared from public view. That part didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was how quickly the conversations changed tone once there was no longer a race to protect. Without an election to win, there was no reason to pretend anymore. Caleb called me 3 days later. "They're doing postmortems," he said. "Official ones?" I asked. "And unofficial. The unofficial ones are more honest." Always are. He hesitated. Your name is coming up. I waited. Not as blame, he added, as absence. That word again. Absence had become the most accurate descriptor of the entire situation. Not in the emotional sense, no one was lamenting or dramatic about it, but in the structural one. People were mapping what had gone wrong, and every path eventually led to a gap they couldn't explain away. Why were decisions slower toward the end? Why did messaging lose coherence? Why did internal disagreements escalate instead of resolving? At first, they tried to answer those questions with abstractions. Burnout, too many cooks, external pressure. But abstractions don't satisfy people who have nothing left to protect. Eventually, someone said the quiet part out loud. We lost the person who integrated everything. No name, just a role. That was enough. I started receiving invitations, not from the campaign, but from adjacent circles. Think tanks, advocacy groups, foundations. Subtle ones at first. We'd love your perspective. Your experience could be valuable. We're reassessing our internal structures. I accepted a few, declined others. Not out of spite, out of selectivity. I had no interest in becoming a cautionary tale or a redemption arc for other people's dysfunction. I wasn't there to help anyone feel better about what they'd ignored. I was there to work with people who didn't need convincing that listening mattered. Lucas reached out once more, an email this time, carefully written, thoughtful. Too late. He didn't ask me to come back. He didn't ask for help. He apologized. Not defensively, not strategically, just plainly. I didn't protect your role, he wrote, and I let other people decide what mattered because it was easier than confronting them. I read the email twice, then once more. Then I replied with 3 sentences. Thank you for saying that. I accept the apology. I'm not available for further discussion. That was the truth. Apologies don't require access. Accountability doesn't require reconciliation. A week later, an article ran, not about the campaign's loss, but about a broader pattern in modern politics. It talked about invisible labor, about gendered expectations, about how organizations often confuse silence with agreement and calm with consent. I was quoted, anonymously. The phrasing made me smile. A former advisor noted that coherence isn't charisma, it's structure. I wished I could claim credit for the line. I couldn't. Someone else had said it better. The comment section was a mess, as always. Some people insisted the campaign failed for ideological reasons. Others blamed donors. A few blamed Lucas personally. A small but growing number said something different. This sounds like a leadership problem. Why do organizations keep sidelining the people who actually think things through? I've seen this exact dynamic at my job. That last one stuck with me, because the story was no longer about politics. It was about pattern recognition. Once you see how power quietly edits people out of rooms, you start seeing it everywhere. In offices, in relationships, in families, in systems that function only because someone absorbs the friction without being acknowledged. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The campaign dissolved officially a month later. Staff scattered, donors moved on, Lucas took time off, life continued, as it always does. One afternoon, I ran into Margaret, Lucas's mother, at a panel discussion in D.C. We made eye contact. She hesitated, then approached. You were very influential, she said, as if stating a neutral fact. Perhaps too much so to be visible. I considered that, then replied, visibility wasn't the problem. Control was. She didn't argue. She didn't agree. She simply nodded, the way people do when they recognize something but aren't ready to own it. As I walked away, I felt something close to amusement, not because I'd been right, but because they were finally having the conversations they should have had when I was still in the room. Too late for that campaign, but not too late for me. The truth is, I didn't walk away to prove a point. I walked away because I understood something fundamental. If your value only becomes clear after you're gone, staying won't make it clearer. It will only make you smaller. And I was done shrinking myself to preserve structures that couldn't survive honesty. Whatever came next, for them or for me, would at least be built on something real, even if it took losing everything else to see it. Closure doesn't arrive the way movies promise. There's no swelling music, no single conversation where everything is named, forgiven, and neatly resolved. Most of the time, closure looks like silence that no longer feels unfinished. That's how it came for me. Quietly, gradually, almost imperceptibly, until one day I realized I wasn't replaying conversations in my head anymore. The weeks after the campaign dissolved were oddly full. Not busy in the frantic way I'd grown used to, but dense, purposeful. I took meetings with people who didn't need me to justify my presence, who didn't ask what I really did, as if expecting a simpler answer underneath. They already knew. One organization brought me in to redesign their decision-making structure. Another asked me to audit how ideas moved, or didn't, through their leadership chain. In both cases, the problem wasn't a lack of talent or resources. It was a lack of respect for synthesis. Everyone wanted innovation. No one wanted to listen long enough to integrate it. At one meeting, a senior executive interrupted me mid-sentence. Old reflexes stirred. Then he stopped himself. "Sorry," he said. "Finish your thought." I did, and the room adjusted. That was new. I didn't become famous. I didn't give TED Talks or write a manifesto about invisible labor. I stayed mostly where I'd always been, just without the illusion that invisibility was a virtue. Lucas faded from headlines, then from conversations, then, gradually, from relevance. I heard he was considering a run again someday, in a different district, with a retooled team. I wished him well, genuinely. But I also knew something he probably didn't yet. Teams don't fail because they lack talent. They fail because they don't know who to listen to, and when. One evening, months later, I was invited to a small dinner. No donors, no press. Just people who worked in systems that quietly shaped outcomes. At some point, the conversation turned to failure. The honest kind. The kind that doesn't need spin. Someone asked me, "Do you regret leaving when you did?" I thought about it carefully. "No," I said. "I regret staying as long as I did." That answer surprised even me. Not because I was angry, but because I finally understood the cost. Staying hadn't just enabled a flawed system. It had taught people how to misuse my silence, how to interpret my patience as permission. Walking away had been the only way to interrupt that lesson. Later that night, as we were clearing plates, someone joked, "So, what's your superpower?" I smiled. I know when to stop explaining myself. They laughed. I meant it. Here's what I learned in the end. People love clarity, but they often resent the people who provide it, especially when that clarity challenges hierarchy, comfort, or ego. So they reframe, they minimize, they sideline, until suddenly the clarity is gone. Then they panic. But panic doesn't create insight. It only reveals what was always missing. I didn't destroy anything by leaving. I revealed it. And that distinction matters, because if you believe walking away is betrayal, you'll stay too long in places that drain you. If you believe silence is strength, you'll keep absorbing damage no one else sees. But if you understand that boundaries are not threats, they're information, everything changes. The campaign didn't fail because I left. It failed because it was never willing to admit how much it relied on someone it refused to protect. And I didn't win by stepping away. I reclaimed something quieter and far more durable: agency. The right to choose where my effort goes. The right to be heard or not engage at all. The right to leave rooms that benefit from my thinking but don't respect my presence. These days, when I walk into a room, I don't wait to see how I'll be categorized. I don't volunteer extra context. I don't soften my language to be palatable. I don't assume misunderstanding is my fault. If someone wants my perspective, they ask. If they don't, I let the system teach itself. And yes, sometimes that means watching people reinvent mistakes I could have prevented in 5 minutes. I won't pretend that isn't occasionally funny. Painful, expensive, preventable mistakes, repeated with confidence. Humanity is nothing if not consistent. But I no longer feel responsible for stopping them, because the final lesson wasn't about power or politics or even visibility. It was this: if your contribution only matters when you're gone, your presence was never truly valued. And the moment you understand that, you stop fighting to be included. You start choosing where you belong. That choice didn't end the story the way some people wanted. It ended it the way it needed to end. With honesty, with distance, and with a clarity no one could take from me, no matter how hard they tried to pretend they never needed it in the first place. And maybe that's where this story really ends. Not with a victory speech, not with a scandal, not even with an apology that fixes everything. It ends with awareness. Because once you've lived inside a system that benefited from your silence, you start recognizing it everywhere. At work, in relationships, in families, in rooms where decisions are made without the people who carry the consequences. If this story felt uncomfortably familiar, that's not an accident. It means you've probably been the one holding things together, the one smoothing edges, the one people only notice when something breaks. And maybe you're standing at that same crossroads right now, wondering whether staying quiet is loyalty or just self-erasure. If this story made you think, pause, or see your own life a little more clearly, then you're exactly who this channel is for. There are more stories like this coming. Stories about power, silence, boundaries, and the moments when women stop shrinking to keep systems comfortable. So if you don't want to miss the next one, subscribe. Stay with us. These stories aren't about revenge. They're about choosing yourself without apologizing for it.